The 2008 prisoner strike is the title of our episode on the 23rd of August 2018 from WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network. We move along here. This is very interesting. It was inspired by The Guardian, and we'll start with it. It's from Ed Pikington in New York, and we encourage you to support The Guardian. It is an international newspaper based in London. U.S. inmates stage a nationwide prisoner strike over modern-day slavery. And when we leave in the canned part, you'll hear from various speakers. We'll get to them in a minute as soon as we get this out of the way. The first part of the prisons are likely to be hit with will be the kitchens, where stoves will remain unlit, ready meals unheated, and thousands of breakfasts uncooked. From there, the impact will fan out. The laundries will be left unwashed. Prison corridors unmopped, and the lawns of the external grounds ring fences with barbed wire will not be cut. On Tuesday, a vast army of incarcerated men and women at 2:30 p.m. Then will be formed by the largest imprisoned population in the world. Will brace itself for potential to be the largest prison strike in U.S. history. 19 days of peaceful protests are planned across the country, organized largely by prisoners themselves. The strike is being spearheaded by incarcerated inmates of the Jailhouse Lawyers Speak, a group of prisoners providing mutual help and legal training to other inmates. A few days ago, they released an anonymous statement setting out the reason for calling a protest that carries a risk of substantial penal retaliation. Fundamentally, it's a human rights issue, the statement said, and prisoners understand that they're being treated as animals. Prisoners in America are in a war zone. Every day, prisoners are harmed due to conditions of confinement. For some of us, as we have already dead, and so we have to be lost. Organizers have put together a list of 10 national demands. They include improved prison conditions, an end to life without parole sentences, death by incarceration, as the authors call themselves, increasing funding for rehabilitative services, and end to disenfranchisement of some 6 million Americans with felony convictions who are barred from voting. And in some states, former inmates can go through a process and their rights can be restored. I believe it's in Maine, where there was an NACP chapter. Inmates are allowed to vote inside the prisons in Maine. One of the most passionately held demands is an immediate end to imposed labor in return for paltry wages of wide-scale practice in U.S. prisons. That strike organizers call modern-day slavery. More than 800,000 prisoners are daily put to work in some states compulsory in roles such as cleaning, cooking, and lawn mowing. The remuneration can be as wonderful in states like Louisiana as 4 cents an hour. The idea of such lowly pay work in $2 billion industries equivalent to slavery is lent weight by the 13th Amendment. You'll hear that discussed there. It bars slavery and involuntary servitude with one exception. As punishment for crimes thereof, the parties shall have been duly convicted. They're talking about the abolishment of the 13th Amendment. That in itself is very, very hard to do. period. The boycott was the brainchild of the Hannibal Ray, son of the Free Alabama movement on the rubric redistribute the pain. He called on fellow prisoners to stop channeling either their own or their relatives' money to what he calls the prison industrial complex. He urged participants to spend 25% of what they saved from the boycott on books such as Prison Profiteers Who Make Money from Mass Incarceration. I won't read all of this, but essentially this is a set of piece. Incidentally, there was a strike in September of 2016. Saw more than 20,000 inmates refused to show up for work across 20 states. The strike was coordinated out of the Holloman prison in Alabama, notorious for its overcrowding, dilapidated penal institutions by a group of inmates calling themselves the Free Alabama Movement. Many of the things that happen in so-called prisons are reforms, I should say, are the work of prisons themselves. The strike was triggered by a riot at the Lee Correctional Institution in South Carolina in April. You'll hear from some of those officials there. The governor, McMaster, I believe is his name, blaming it on the prisoners. Within days of South Carolina's carnage and renewal, spotlight had put on the grossly overcrowded, understaffed, inhumane living conditions in American prisons. The idea of a national strike begun. As inspiration for the what promises to be a tough 20 days ahead, the national action began on Tuesday, the 47th anniversary death of George Jackson. If you remember George Jackson, he escaped he tried to escape the yard at San Quentin in California. The strike is then scheduled to close on the 9th of September, the 47th anniversary of the Attica rebellion that was in upstate New York in 1971. So there is history involved here. Heather Ann Thompson, the Pulitzer Prize winning author, Blood in the Water, the Attica prison uprising in 1971, said that it was symbolically important that Attica was being invoked. Attica drew a line in the sand. There was a recognition that people had rights to rebel and will rebel when they are forced into unbelievable, horrid conditions. Now let me just take care of a little bit of housekeeping here. The final straw is out of the prisoners' strike. Is one of the resources we fall back upon here. These are podcasts over various radio stations, one out of Nashville, North Carolina. And on the 21st, the call for the 2018 prisoner strike, jailhouse lawyers speak pre-strike statements. This will go on in our can for immediate international solidarity with the prisoner strike. This is on the 21st. We started preparing this production on the 21st of August. Inside Out, all of the same side prison strike roundtable, the final straw. We'll hear from them. We'll also hear from a gentleman out of Oakland at the IWOC, or the IWW. On the 21st in the Northwest, that's in Seattle, there will be a kickoff rally there, or there was, I should say, and a day of action in Portland, Oregon. Running down some of the list here in the Southwest, letter writing and film screening. That'll be in Sacramento, California, in San Jose Awareness Month. And we will Tuesday, the 21st, that was yesterday, Tuesday, the California Institution for Women, that's in Chino, California. Where to write there? That is Corona, California. Let me get the rest of the number here. 16756 Chino Corona Road, Corona, California 92880. Again, 16756 Chino Corona Road, Corona, California 92880. You should get that, and that will get you in the door, so to speak, here. And let's see. Wait a minute here. The final straw, that is a conversation about the prisoner strike with members of the IWOC and with Nwami Aswami. You'll hear from her also here. And the words expressed a little bit contradictory, they say here, from viewpoints expressed. You'll hear from Brooke in Oakland, California, IWOC, the IWW, and an appeal there also for Sean Swain. Sean Swain, if you're missing the voice of Sean Swain, he is in Ohio, Department of Rehabilitation and Correction. Gary Moeller at 614-387-05588. A call for warden of the correction there, Harris. He's at 513-932-3388. And there's also a fax number there too. Some of this. And let's see what else we can get here. Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee, a major committee of their that's on the 21st strike. Statement from inmates at Burnside Jail, that's in Nova Scotia. So it is an international, that's in Canada. And from the jailhouse lawyers, we put that one forward also. And from NPR, we use the NPR statement. And it's one of few corporate medias that covered U.S. inmates' planned nationwide prison strike to protest labor conditions. Plan a series of strikes, and we played this recording. Let me just get back here. I want to get to this gentleman out of Chicago, Illinois here. Jeremy Gardner spent 27 years in prison. He was innocent, one of 144 that were falsified evidence, by a member of the state police. Let's hear from him.
Conviction.
Was he a prosecutor?
Well, the prosecutors, I feel, had knowledge that this guy was coming in, providing false information. But Fred Zane was a West Virginia state trooper, and he was a chief serologist. So he was the main witness. He was the state's star witness. Fred Zane went through a period of 10 years from 1979 to 1989 of falsifying documents and testifying falsely at prisoners' trials. In 1993, the state of West Virginia did an investigation on Fred Zane. And within this investigation, the West Virginia State Supreme Court concluded that Fred Zane had actually committed malfeasance, testified falsely, and provided false evidence on over 140 cases.
Wow.
And everybody from those cases, everyone was supposed to get a review on their case and have an opportunity to go through the court system and receive a new trial or an automatic reversal or whatever may come from the procedures. A lot of guys didn't get that opportunity, including myself. West Virginia heard maybe about 10 to 15 cases, let about 5 guys go rightfully, and shut the door on all the other guys.
That was Jamie Gardner. Spent 27 years in prison, and he was innocent there. from that was last August. But anyway, nonetheless, we have many people who have been falsely incarcerated. We'll go now to our CAN segment, and various people, Ms. Swami Brook out of Oakland, he'll talk about the organizing efforts of the IWOC, and how this labor union, a small labor union, related to prisoners. And its long tradition also, he does say something about it, and where it was historically in the American labor movement. The other labor unions won't touch it. In fact, the Teamsters and several others are organizing guards. And this is one thing to remember here on the day after the convictions in the matter of two former Trump officials. Manafort, he was a campaign manager. He was convicted of 8 counts, and I believe on 10 they were hung. Listen to the case. We'd expected that a number of counts would either be hung or he would be acquitted. He was not acquitted, but he was convicted. That was Manafort, primarily for tax evasion, etc. Now, the case that was very close to DJ Trump was his longtime attorney, over 10 years, Mr. Cohen, who in his plea bargain agreement, because the feds had told him he could serve up to 10 years, said that Trump knew about his arrangements with Stormy Daniels and also with the Playboy model, McDougal, I think was her name. So it was a situation whereby he was primarily the bagman, and he had recordings to back this up. It was a big headline there, effectively from the Associated Press, the worst day for the Trump administration on yesterday. I don't know if I still have that headline here. Back-to-back legal blows in Trump's circle jolts to presidency. Now, this was an AP article. This is a Chronicle in Houston, Texas, but it was all over the place. I read just a little bit of it here. President Trump confronted one of the most precarious moments of his presidency Tuesday after two of his longtime members of his inner circle simultaneously were labeled guilty of criminal charges, although Trump largely ignored the jarring back-to-back blows at a campaign rally. He was in Charleston, West Virginia. Questions abound about possible legal exposure and political future. In a split screen for the history books, Trump's former campaign manager Manafort was convicted of financial crimes at nearly the same moment as the president's personal attorney Michael Cohen pleaded guilty to a series of felonies, including campaign finance violations, and he said that Trump knew about it. These men played prominent roles in the 2016 Trump campaign, no doubt about it. And Trump here cites his summit with Chairman Ung in North Korea, trade, taxes, I guess his trade wars, and Space Force. What we are doing is winning, he told a cheering crowd. Where is the collusion? He demanded, underscoring the Manafort crime that occurred before he became involved with the Trump campaign. So this is some of it here. Of course, he was convicted in Virginia on charges by the special prosecutor Mueller, who is investigating the Russian interference. And, of course, Cohen, as we said before, the Playboy model, and Stormy Daniels, the Playboy model, was McDougal. But nonetheless, Trump has shown his uncanny ability to shake off relentless streams of accusations and jarring statements that provoked outrage. His loyal base of supporters, which he had there in Charlotte, Virginia, blaming his effort to blame both sides for deadly violence there in Charlotte, Virginia. He was incidentally, I believe, in West Virginia, was he not? Yeah. In West Virginia, drain the swamp. Well, he has, as they say, created a new swamp. Lock her up. He's referring to Hillary the Monster Clinton, but his advisors are the one being locked up. So it's a kind of an interesting flippable there from DJ Trump. This is a good place to end our broadcast, the Prison Strike 2018, on the 22nd of August 2018. I think we said that before. Nonetheless,
Cheryl, organizers say they're expecting this to be the country's largest prison strike. It's not the first. Tell us how it's being organized and how we know how many people might participate.
Well, Audie, prisoners have been planning this strike for a while, and they were spurred in part by a prison strike that occurred a couple of years ago in 2016, and by a prison riot that occurred in South Carolina earlier this year. That riot left about 7 people dead and several more injured. Prison officials said that was due to gangs, but prisoners said it happened because of the poor prison conditions, and that's one of the reasons for this strike. Organizers with a group called Jailhouse Lawyers say inmates in more than 17 states are participating, people outside the country too, and they tell me they get word out about the strike in a variety of ways, through prison newspapers, by word of mouth, or even by radio if inmates have access to that. And I talked to Nia Beach, who works at Cateline Radio. That's a prison radio show that acts as an avenue for people in prison and the formerly incarcerated.
We definitely know that prisoners in Canada have already launched their strikes, and we have confirmation about South Carolina and Louisiana. We do have striking prisoners at the Hyde Correctional Facility in North Carolina, too.
And organizers say they expect those numbers to spread, but they really won't have any idea about how many people participated for months if they get those numbers at all.
The prisoners do have a list of demands. They're calling for more rehabilitation programs, improved conditions. What else are they asking for?
Well, they want sentencing reform. For example, they want to get rid of sentences of life without parole. They want an end to the practice in some states of not allowing people with felony convictions to vote. But one of the biggest issues is prison labor. The inmates say they want to be paid the prevailing wage because they do all sorts of jobs, most often for the prison itself, like working in a kitchen or doing laundry. But they also do work for private companies. And University of Michigan historian Heather Ann Thompson just says it's really a mixed bag when it comes to prison labor. She wrote a book about the Attica prison riot, and she says we often don't know much about prison labor because prisons aren't required to report that activity. What we do know is that prisoners are saying it's modern-day slave labor, and Thompson says they do typically make very little money, on average about 4 to 20 cents on the dollar, if at all.
Folks are not making enough money even to be able to pay their commissary charges, to be able to send money back home to their children. So it really is an exploitative situation no matter what the labor is that's being done.
And Thompson and other folks say, yes, work in prison does have value, but they say what's going on inside prisons is exploitive and can hurt workers outside as well, depending on what type of work those prison inmates are actually doing.
Given how much we know about this already, how are prison authorities responding?
Well, just a couple of responses today. The Federal Bureau of Prisons said earlier there haven't been any reports of inmate work strikes in any of its facilities. And the head of the North American Association of Wardens really didn't address any concerns directly, but said if there is a major action by inmates, either violent or nonviolent, that there are policies and procedures to address it.
I'm in Asheville, North Carolina. This is The Final Straw, and I'm William Goodenough. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions, comments, or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net. Also, if you're interested in rebroadcasting any episode or segment of the show, you're free to do so. Just send us an email if you end up using any content. If you care to, you can send us letters at our new address, which is The Final Straw Radio, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina 28816. The show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop.
This week I had two conversations, both focusing on the upcoming prisoner strike from August 21st to September 9th, 2018. One with a member of the IWOC or IWOC, and one with Amani Sawari, a media liaison for some of the prisoners who called for the strike. In part one, Amani Sawari will speak about the prison strike, the need to increase opportunities for release and civic engagement for prisoners and former prisoners in the face of historical disenfranchisement, and she'll be reading some statements and demands from the prisoner organizers. Then we'll hear from Brooke, an organizer with the Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee of the IWW. Brooke is based in Oakland, California. He'll talk about IWOC and their role and the views of prison organizing, labor organizing, and the upcoming strike. More from IWOC can be found at incarceratedworkers.org. More from Amani Sawari can be found at sawarimi.org. That's sawarimi.org. The viewpoints expressed by the two guests are at times contradictory and at others redundant, but we felt it better to keep their voices mostly intact and distinct rather than trying to weave them to create a streamlined narrative.
As many listeners have no doubt heard, the remaining 38 J20 defendants got their charges dropped the other day without prejudice. This means that the cases could theoretically be opened again at any time, though this is thought to be pretty unlikely. This is a historical moment not only for the courts, who were staggeringly unable to rise to the occasion, humiliating themselves at pretty much every possible turn, but also for anarchists everywhere. This whole long, difficult year and a half forged bonds that are all the more strong for having gone through the fire together, which can and no doubt will experience similar oppressions, difficulties, and tough breaks with the same finesse and resilience which was demonstrated here. To anyone listening who is personally affected by this, you are an inspiration. Now we get to celebrate, and now we get to feel the full extent of our power.
And to Kirchhoff and Qureshi, f*** you! You lost. Whew. Got to say it. If you're missing the voice of Sean Swain, like we are, here's a little plug with his voice to get some juices flowing. 4-387-0588. Or you could call Warren Correctional Warden Shay Harris at 513-932-3388. That's 513-932-3388. And ask them about Sean's whereabouts and restrictions to his communication. If you find out anything interesting, maybe that we haven't learned yet here, about his silence, you can drop us an email at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net, or you can email Sean Swain at riseup.net. Thanks a lot. Meanwhile, here's a jingle for a show on the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts.
In the eyes of the government, we are the...
In a world where there is no government, anarchy rules. This summer, get ready for the most action-packed podcast.
We continue fighting because we hate all authority and
on the site sawarimi.org, and I came into this work through my work with Crystal Roundtree and Millions for Prisoners last year. I worked heavily on the August 21st strike that was in Washington, D.C., and came up into this following year.
That's awesome. And how did the strike go last year?
Last year it went really well. We had a monthly newsletter that went out between the 12th and the 15th of every month, and I wrote that newsletter. It was called No Shackles, and that helped kind of gain community support inside and connect the inside prisoners with the organizations on the outside that were supporting them. I got to attend the march that was in Washington, D.C., and there was a great number of people that came all across the country to meet up and voice our opinions about prisoners' rights and human rights.
And can you talk about what was mobilizing people on the inside and the outside? Like, what is it about the situation of prisoners in the United States that listeners should understand and be outraged and act to join in this mobilization for this year's strike?
Listeners need to understand that prisoners are human beings and should be able to, that are fulfilling and live lives where they feel like they can accomplish their goals someday. They should be treated like humans, and they should be able to have the right to vote, which is a big right that we're fighting for right now with the national prison strike. We don't just want to have a strike where everyone comes out and marches on one day and then forgets about prisoners' rights. Prisoners are inside and they want to have legislative power so that they can make changes in their communities, especially those that are serving decades-long sentences and life sentences. They want to be able to have an impact on their community and have a political impact inside and outside.
What can you tell us about the process of engaging with prisoners to amplify these demands and organize on the outside based on desires from the inside? Like, how does prisoner-led organizing translate into the outside world?
I think prisoner-led organizing in this realm is the most powerful type of organizing that you can do, because the prisoners know exactly what's happening on the inside, and they don't know what's happening on the outside to support them until they see us. So they bring out these demands, and some of the demands that are listed in for the national prison strike are giving prisoners the right to vote, having Pell Grants reinstated in all the U.S. territories, improvements on prison policies, and an end to prison slavery, so an end to private corporations taking advantage of prisoners, working for them when they're incarcerated. These are some of the demands. So when prisoners put out these demands, people on the outside are able to show their support for those demands by having rallies, having marches, saying that they refuse to shop at places like Starbucks, places like Victoria's Secret, and other businesses that use prison labor. It's these types of actions that we do on the outside that show people on the inside that we're supporting them. And the more that we take these steps in refusing to participate with these businesses, and going out and voicing, hey, we want prisoners' rights to be heard, the more they see us supporting them and the stronger that they can become, because the guys and the women on the inside are really facing some dangerous risks by choosing to be leaders in a prison strike movement. So the least we can do is support them when they say, hey, can you guys boycott these companies?
I feel like the way that prisons are talked about in American culture and American politics, for the most part, is to point to the guilt or the undeservingness of individuals who are behind bars. And an implication of that is that people who are behind bars, alongside of just there being bars and barbed wires and difficulty for people to get to the prisons to visit their loved ones or family members or what have you, is this social shaming that happens around incarceration. So for someone who's listening who maybe has a conservative bent, and I doubt they're going to listen to the podcast, but they might hear it on the radio and be like,
right?
Well, what about these like undeserving people who have already hurt people? Like, why should they have any of these things? They don't deserve this. They need to be locked up in a cage. How do you like talk to folks like that and sort of point to outside of just saying, well, you know, these are human beings. Like, there are systemic problems that cause certain people to be incarcerated at higher rates than other people. And a lot of that has to do with race, and a lot of that has to do with class, and a lot of that has to do with gender. Like, how do you start that conversation? And for listeners who maybe want to start those conversations, do you have any like tips of maybe directions to start talking to churchgoers or loved ones or community members?
I think the biggest thing that we have to remember is when someone does a crime against society or is found guilty of committing a crime against society, that crime can't be completely repaid, and that healing can't happen until that individual is brought back out into society to serve society. So just throwing someone away and saying, hey, we're going to shame you for the rest of your life, regardless of what they did, whether it's stealing, killing, destroying, whatever, we're going to send you away and never look at you again. No one is served by that. nothing good comes out of that. A lot of these men and women go into prison and they rediscover themselves and redefine who they are. And they think to themselves, okay, now I have these goals. The purpose of someone going to prison and being rehabilitated is for them to rethink about who they want to be. They think about who they were, and then they come out, hopefully, a different person that wants to serve their society. If people aren't coming back out to serve society, then it's a huge cost, which we see in a financial way, but it's also a huge social cost and a societal cost, because we never see these people come back into the world and use their gifts and their talents and their strengths to serve us. Every single individual that's incarcerated is connected to hundreds of other people and has gifts and talents that could be used for the greater good. The cure to cancer could be in a prison cell. You never know what's in there that we need back out with us. And we need to give these individuals the resources to be able to be all that they're supposed to be. And we can't do that by continuing to dehumanize and degrade them and steal from their families in the process.
So you use the term prison slavery, and that's a term that I've heard from people, for instance, in the Free Alabama movement, inside and outside prisoner organizing in that southern state. And they kind of take some of the ideas of Michelle Alexander and run with them a little bit further, saying that the passage of the 13th Amendment didn't in fact abolish slavery in the United States. It just opened a different door for racialized incarceration and forced labor. And that creates a second tier of citizenship for people who do get outside, as you said, don't necessarily have the right to vote, for instance. Can you talk about that continuation of racialized incarceration and forced labor in the United States? And I don't know if this is actually, I jumped into this without asking you if this is a view that you take yourself, but.
Oh, this definitely is a view that I take. And a lot of incarcerated folks are calling for the abolishing of the 13th Amendment. The strike that I participated in last year, the Millions for Prisoners Human Rights March, called for the abolishing of the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment just reassigned the way that slavery would be used. It would no longer be based on race. So now it was expanded to be based on someone being assigned a criminal and having this criminal status, which would, as you said, place them in a second class for the rest of their lives in a lot of cases in a lot of states. When the 13th Amendment was written, it wrote slavery into the Constitution. Slavery wasn't mentioned in this sort of way until that amendment was written. So to end slavery, we need to take the 13th Amendment out of the Constitution because it doesn't serve us. And if prisoners are saying now we want to remove this amendment, if the descendants of slaves are saying now we don't want this amendment, then why are we continuing to allow it to govern the way that we do criminal justice and the way that we treat people? So yes, I do hold that view. And I feel like the 13th Amendment is what a lot of this is built on. And once it's removed, then we can look for other policy changes so that slavery isn't in practice in this country anymore.
Like the word of IWOC spreading, hand to hand, the literature being spread around, or having effective campaigns or a strong local outside really tends to help boost the relationship between the inside and the outside. Other folks from states where we don't have a strong local or presence within the facility might just be thumbing through another publication and reach out at random, basically to get reading material or start corresponding, or basically inquire, like, who are you and what do you do? That's quite often a letter we get, just simply inquiring as to like what the nature of our institution is and wanting to learn more.
An interesting thing about the IWW, I think, is its historical role in attempting to organize outside of the framework of how power wants people to organize. For instance, like a lot of the small shop organizing that you can see happening over the last decade and a half that the IWW has been involved with on the outside doesn't necessarily fall within the bounds of, as far as I'm aware, like National Labor Relations Board, like NLRB, style of organizing, and it's more of like a power campaign by working folks with actually engaging in it. And I think that's interesting. And you brought up street organizations. Could you talk a little bit about the attempt to organize inside and outside, and sort of if there's much of a precedent for outside of street organizations that may have people within and people without organizing through the prison walls?
Yeah, I mean, the largest and most notable inside-outside organizing and explicitly political effort in the 20th century was the Nation of Islam, which had an immense influence, like not only on the prisoners movement, but on basically the Black liberation struggle after World War II and before. I think there have been some histories written on this rather recently. As far as labor unions go, there was, a big push in the 70s in about 4 different states that I know of, possibly more. But there was a North Carolina, prisoners union. There was a California, prisoners union. And these were essentially more organized along the lines of a typical labor union, basically seeking redress, for wage, grievances and condition grievances, and following the more typical kind of negotiation route and seeking recognition as a union. They had their own publications, and trying to unearth this these days is like quite a challenge. I don't think there's been a lot of scholarship on this yet. What we find are like scraps and little stacks of old mimeographed newsletters from the 70s that someone held on to. The periodicity of, how often these uprisings are happening is the tempo is increasing. Again, it's kind of hard to get good data on this because essentially right now there's a prison that's undergoing an uprising right now. Like we don't know where it is or what it is, but it's happening. And we will only get news essentially if certain things happen, if it makes it to an outside reporter. There might be a reporter that has a beat that includes the prison, so news will get out. Someone might work at an emergency room at a local hospital tour facility, so news of the injuries will get out, and then the story will happen. So the news we get of it is pretty hit or miss. But once you start paying attention and picking up all the little signs, and also once you learn to completely disbelieve anything the DOCs tell you, like about an uprising or this being squelched, you learn to read between the lines to see exactly what's going on. And these uprisings increasing in frequency, and they're starting to develop a much more political character. They're much less about. There's still plenty of fights and still plenty of really close to a major institution. Like most of California's institutions are purposefully located in Central Valley in what's called, the prison corridor, and in remote rural areas. A lot of the work happens through correspondence. A lot of the work happens through writing or finding resources for prisoners. A lot of the work can be done remotely. One of the challenges, though, is finding other people to do the work with you. We have to get better at how to organize across geographical distance. And that's just challenging no matter what you're doing. But the demand of the work, we're up against an incredibly opaque, violent, and empowered institution. And we're doing also, I don't know how many of your listeners have actually done really intense care labor or been on the front lines either as an RN or an emergency room nurse or a social worker, or basically been exposed to trauma day in, day out, if not their own, other people's. A huge chunk of the work is incredibly difficult because you basically wake up and go to bed with misery, with violence on your mind. There's nothing pretty about it. And how to basically strategize and continue your work and also just, maintain your own humanity and not become some glib social worker type that just barely even hears your name and just does stuff mechanically. To remain effective and a full human being, demands a collective, demands a group, demands help. I mean, as much as kind of nuts and bolts material work that our Oakland chapter does, half the value is just being there to listen to each other and supporting the blessings of Roman citizenship under an empire. You touch them and you go to jail. Reverse it is a completely different process. 4, the Truth in Sentencing Act and the Sentencing Reform Act must be rescinded so that imprisoned humans have a possibility of rehabilitation and parole. No human shall be sentenced to death by incarceration or serve any sentence without the possibility of parole. These supposed reform acts were basically, they were to take away like life imprisonment or determined sentencing. They're basically to change sentencing guidelines, but what's been done in effect are create what's called Buck Rogers sentences, where you get sentences of like 100 years. Oh, congratulations, you've taken that away, life without parole, but with consecutive 25-year sentences, you've effectively done the same thing. It's a liberal,
workaround,
shuffling of the cards. Yeah. 3, the Prison Litigation Reform Act must be rescinded, allowing imprisoned humans a proper channel to address grievances and violations of their rights. Now, the Prison Litigation Reform Act in the 90s essentially killed the ability for prisoners to litigate on their own behalf. Not only is it immensely hard to get a hold of nowadays any legal library inside, they say they're provided, but not really. Sometimes you sit jailed in essentially a mesh steel coffin with your hands like chained to a bench, and from 10 feet away inside something the size of a broom closet, you get to choose what book you get to reference. Sometimes that's what's called your legal library. And you have to basically already know what to look for in order to basically construct a case. The Prison Litigation Reform Act actually took away, they would defer filing fees. They would, now, if you file more than 3 times, you basically have to file like anybody else does on the outside, and $400 for someone to file in federal court on the inside, and you're making 6 cents an hour, ironing clothes in the laundry, that's like effectively banned, like litigation.
Or accessible only to people who have access to family or community on the outside who do have funding. Exactly.
So it's effectively taken away a prisoner's ability to litigate on their own behalf if you're poor. 2, an immediate end to prison slavery. All persons imprisoned in any place of detention within the United States jurisdiction must be paid the prevailing wage in their state or territory for their labor. Do I need to go into that? I mean, they're compelled to work. There's nothing voluntary about it. People say that they want, like a lot of people will say like these jobs, they volunteer for them. Well, they do when the alternatives are like what we already described as solitary or the hole or complete boredom, or like living within a facility where they welded steel plates over the windows to deny you sunlight. Suddenly, like working in the laundry for like 8 hours for 6 cents an hour, suddenly that looks good. When they deny you toothpaste and shower shoes, when you basically got to work your ass off in order to get those, suddenly, like, working in a fire camp looks good. That's compulsion. Plus, like, the only reason prisons operate whatsoever at this scale is due to the labor of prisoners. It's not because of Victoria's Secret. It's not because of working in AT&T call room. Those things happen. But the majority of prison labor is towards the functioning of the prison itself. And this level of incarceration and social control would not be possible whatsoever without the compelled labor of its prisoners. And also notable, if you refuse a work assignment, at least in California, you lose visitation, commissary rights, and all kinds of rights. You basically knock down the class of prisoner. So if you weren't already getting beat up enough, if you refuse a work assignment, you basically get knocked down to level B or C, which means like you might only be allowed 1 emergency phone call a month, and 1/3 of the level of commissary that you're allowed, which is $30 a month. And number 1, immediate improvements to the conditions of prisons and prison policies that recognize the humanity of imprisoned men and women. A basic call for humanity. Those are the 10 demands. And they've called for